It started with a seemingly innocent suggestion over Sunday dinner, but the calculating gleam in my son's eyes told a different story. "Mom," Mark began, leaning forward with that practiced look of earnest concern, "Sarah and I have been talking. The kids are getting bigger. This house just isn't enough space anymore. And well, you have the place on Elm Street. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe family should protect, not exploit each other, hit that like button and subscribe for more." The unspoken demand hung in the air, thick with expectation. The house on Elm Street was my sanctuary, a small cottage I'd inherited from my grandmother, a place filled with memories and quiet comfort. It wasn't a grand estate, but it was mine, free and clear, representing security and a lifetime of careful saving. It was also the asset they seemed to view not as something I owned, but as something reserved for them. I had always been generous, especially after my husband, Thomas, passed away 2 years prior. My grief had been immense, and in the fog of it, I'd leaned heavily on Mark and Sarah, perhaps too heavily. I'd helped Mark through college, paid off Sarah's student loans, and bailed them out of financial scrapes more times than I could count. I'd funded extravagant family vacations and covered down payments for their cars. My life, once shared with Thomas, had increasingly revolved around their needs and the lives of my 2 young grandchildren. This pattern of giving was deeply ingrained, a quiet habit born of love and a desire to ease their burdens. But the Elm Street request felt different. It wasn't a request for help, it was a demand for an asset, presented with a proprietary air that chilled me. It was the first tremor of the earthquake that would force me to choose between a lifetime of family loyalty and the absolute necessity of self-preservation. My life, post-Thomas, was structured around routine and the comfortable silence of my home. I was in my late 60s, financially secure thanks to Thomas's pension and my own careful investments over the years. I owned my primary residence outright, a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, and the smaller, cherished cottage on Elm Street. The cottage wasn't a rental property, it was simply a place I went to read, think, and remember Thomas, who had loved its small garden. Mark, my only son, was in his early 40s, married to Sarah, a woman I had initially welcomed into the family with open arms. They had 2 children, my beloved grandchildren, who were the light of my life. I adored them and had always believed my role was to support my family in any way I could. This meant not just emotional support, but financial assistance, whenever they needed it. Mark had a decent job and Sarah worked part-time, but they always seemed to be just a little short, just needing a little boost. A car repair, a sudden medical bill, school expenses, there was always something. I never minded. They were my family, and helping them felt like the right thing to do. My relationship with Mark had shifted after Thomas's death. He seemed to step into a more protective role, which I initially appreciated. But soon, protective felt more like controlling. He'd question my spending, ask about my investments, and gently probe about my will. Sarah, who had always been polite but somewhat distant, became much more attentive, frequently asking about my health and my plans for the future. Looking back, the signs were there, small entitlements that grew bolder. The assumption I would pay for everything when we were out, the casual way they spoke of my assets as future inheritances, the expectation that I would babysit whenever they needed without asking if I was free. They saw my generosity not as a gift, but as a right. One evening, after a particularly lengthy discussion about their need for more space and the suitability of the Elm Street cottage, I retreated to my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I heard Mark and Sarah talking downstairs. Their voices were low at first, then rose slightly, edged with impatience. "She just sits there, Mom," Sarah said, a hint of frustration in her voice. "What does she even do with 2 houses?" "It's ridiculous, I know," Mark replied, his tone tired. "But we have to be careful. We can't scare her. Just keep pushing gently. Remind her about the kids. She's soft when it comes to them. We just need to make sure we get what's coming to us." That cottage is just the beginning. The words landed like stones in my gut. They weren't talking about a gift. They were talking about taking something they felt entitled to. Not just the cottage, but what's coming to us. My entire estate, perhaps. Their true attitude, cold and calculating, stripped away the veneer of loving concern. That night, sleep offered no escape. The conversation replayed in my mind, each word a confirmation of betrayal. They weren't just struggling, they were scheming. The pain was visceral, a deep ache of disappointment that settled heavy in my chest. My son, my only child, and his wife, whom I had welcomed and supported, saw me only as a source of funds, an obstacle to their inheritance. The initial shock gave way to a wave of hurt so profound it left me breathless. How could they? How could they be so cold, so presumptuous? I tried to rationalize it, to find an excuse for their behavior. Maybe they were just under a lot of stress. Maybe they didn't fully grasp the value of what they were asking for, or the implications of their entitlement. Maybe they genuinely believed I didn't need the cottage. But the phrase, "what's coming to us," echoed, raw and undeniable. It wasn't about need, it was about greed. The denial was a flimsy shield against the truth, and it crumbled quickly. The gentle probes about my finances, the protective oversight, the constant needs, it all clicked into place, a mosaic of manipulation I had been too trusting, too blinded by love, to see. I was not a mother to be cherished. I was an asset to be managed and eventually liquidated. The thought spurred a cold clarity. If they saw me as an asset, then I needed to secure that asset before they found a way to claim it prematurely. My first defensive action was small, almost instinctive. I got out of bed, went to my desk, and pulled out the heavy fireproof box where I kept important documents. I located the deed to the Elm Street cottage and the most recent statements for my investment accounts and bank accounts. I didn't know exactly what I was protecting them from yet, but holding them felt like taking a first step onto solid ground in a world that suddenly felt very shaky. I locked the box securely and placed it back in the safe spot. It was a small act, but it marked the end of my passive acceptance. I was no longer just a grieving widow or a generous mother. I was a woman whose safety and autonomy were under threat, and I needed to act. The pressure subtly increased in the following weeks. Mark would call, ostensibly just to check in, but the conversation would inevitably drift back to housing. "Mom, have you thought any more about the cottage? Sarah saw some curtains that would be perfect for the living room there," or "a friend of ours just bought a place and their mortgage payments are actually less than our rent." It really makes you think, doesn't it? Sarah started sending me links to articles about downsizing and the benefits of living a simpler life without the burden of managing multiple properties. They spoke of the cottage as if its transition to their ownership was a foregone conclusion, a matter of timing rather than a decision I had any real agency in. Their entitlement was palpable, cloaked in concern for my well-being or the future of the grandchildren. "It would be so good for the kids to have more space, Mom. A yard to run in. And imagine, you get to see them there all the time." The emotional blackmail was deployed with a practiced ease that made my stomach clench. Meanwhile, I began my quiet counter-operation. I started documenting everything. I saved every text message, printed out every email, and started a small, leather-bound notebook where I meticulously recorded the date and details of every conversation where they mentioned the cottage, my finances, or my future plans in a suggestive or demanding way. I noted their tone, their specific words, and my responses. It felt cold and clinical, turning interactions with my son and daughter-in-law into case notes, but the clarity it provided was invaluable. Seeing their tactics laid out on paper, stripped of the familial context, revealed the patterns of manipulation more clearly than ever before. The guilt, the thinly veiled demands, the assumptions, it was all there. The next crucial step was professional advice. I knew I was out of my depth. This wasn't just a family misunderstanding. It involved significant assets and potential legal implications if they decided to escalate. I made an appointment with a lawyer recommended by a friend from my bridge club, a woman I trusted implicitly. Mr. Harrison was calm, thorough, and listened with a steady gaze as I recounted the story, reading from my notebook and showing him the saved messages. He explained my rights regarding my property, my will, and my ability to make decisions about my own life and finances. He outlined the legal steps they might attempt if they were truly determined, things like challenging my competency, seeking guardianship, or contesting my will later. Hearing the cold legal terms applied to my family situation was jarring, but it reinforced the seriousness of the threat. He advised me on how to secure my assets, update my will to explicitly state my wishes and disinherit anyone attempting undue influence, and how to establish clear legal boundaries. He also advised me on creating a durable power of attorney and a healthcare directive, appointing someone I trusted completely, not Mark or Sarah, to make decisions if I ever became unable. This felt like building a legal fortress around myself. As I became less responsive to their suggestions and gently deflected their questions about the cottage, Mark and Sarah sensed the shift. Their patience wore thin. The casual mentions turned into more direct confrontations. One afternoon, Mark showed up at my house unexpectedly, letting himself in with the spare key I'd foolishly never retrieved. Sarah was with him. They sat on my sofa, radiating a tense energy. "Mom, we need to talk seriously," Mark started, his voice tight. "We can't keep waiting around. We need a bigger place now. The Elm Street house is the obvious solution. It's just sitting there empty." "It's not empty, Mark," I replied calmly, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. Use it for what?" Sarah interjected, her polite facade cracking. "To dust the furniture?" "It's not fair, Mom. We're your family. Your grandchildren need a stable home with space to grow." "This is about family helping family." Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "We know you're comfortable, Mom. Very comfortable. It's only right that you help us out when you have the means. Dad would have wanted you to take care of us." The audacity of using Thomas's memory as leverage ignited a quiet fury within me. "Thomas would have wanted you to work hard and build your own life, Mark," I said, my voice low. "He certainly wouldn't have approved of you demanding property that isn't yours," Sarah scoffed. "Demanding? We're talking about our future. Your legacy. That house is just sitting there losing value when it could be put to good use." Our good use, this was it. The masks were off. It wasn't about need or even shared family space. It was about claiming what they felt was already theirs. In that moment, my resolve hardened completely. There was no more room for doubt or hoping they would change. They were not just entitled, they were predatory. I stood up. "I think you should leave," I said, walking towards the door. "We can discuss this another time." Mark stood up too, his face red. "Discuss what, Mom? You keeping what should rightfully be ours? Don't make this difficult." "It doesn't have to be difficult. Get out, Mark," I repeated, opening the door. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Fine," she hissed, shooting me a venomous look. "But don't say we didn't warn you." As they left, the implication hung in the air, a threat disguised as a warning. They clearly believed they held the power, perhaps underestimating my intelligence or my willingness to fight. They thought they could pressure me into submission. But they were wrong. I closed the door, leaned against it, and took a deep breath. Their visit had been ugly, but it had also been clarifying. My path was now clear. I would secure my future on my terms. The smoking gun didn't come from a dramatic discovery, but from a mundane piece of mail. A few weeks after their demand turned ugly, I received a letter from a legal firm I didn't recognize, addressed to me but concerning the Elm Street property. It was a request for information, seemingly routine, about the property's boundaries and history, stating it was in relation to a potential future matter. The phrasing was vague but unsettling. My instincts screamed. I immediately sent a copy to Mr. Harrison. He investigated quietly and discovered the firm had been contacted by a party expressing interest in the property and asking about ways to potentially acquire it, even exploring options like a reverse mortgage, which I didn't have, or challenging ownership based on potential future inheritance claims. While they hadn't filed anything official, they were clearly probing legal avenues to gain control of my property, presumably on behalf of Mark and Sarah. This wasn't just entitlement anymore. This was active investigation into how to legally dispossess me. It was definitive proof they were not just waiting for me to give in, but were actively planning ways to take the house. This quiet discovery solidified my course of action. They were exploring legal weapons. I needed to acquire my own. Mr. Harrison confirmed my suspicions. They hadn't initiated anything formal, but the inquiry was a clear indication of their intent. It was the leverage I needed to move decisively without guilt. If they were planning to take my property through legal means, I was justified in protecting it by any legal means available to me. My counter-strategy was set in motion immediately. With Mr. Harrison's guidance, I finalized the paperwork to list the Elm Street cottage for sale. We chose a different realtor, outside my immediate neighborhood, to maintain discretion. The market was good, and Mr. Harrison advised moving quickly to ensure the property was sold and the funds secured before Mark and Sarah could potentially initiate any formal challenge that might tie up the asset. Simultaneously, Mr. Harrison drafted a new will, explicitly removing Mark and Sarah as beneficiaries and stating my reasons, attempting undue influence and financial coercion. We also set up the durable power of attorney and healthcare directive, appointing my trusted friend and her husband, who lived in another state and had no financial ties to Mark. These documents were notarized and securely stored. Mark and Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to interpret my silence and lack of immediate capitulation as either stubbornness they could eventually wear down, or perhaps even confusion on my part. They continued their subtle pressure, though less overtly demanding than before. They would call, offering to help with managing my finances or suggesting I let them handle the upkeep of the Elm Street cottage, since they were considering taking it on. They were overconfident, assuming their familial bond and my past generosity gave them inherent power and control over my decisions. They seemed utterly unaware that I was not only resisting, but was actively dismantling the future they felt was their right. While they were busy strategizing how to take the house, I was busy selling it. The process moved efficiently. The cottage was small but charming, and it attracted a buyer quickly. I accepted a cash offer, which expedited the closing process. Everything was handled through Mr. Harrison's office and the realtor, with minimal direct involvement from me, reducing the chances of Mark or Sarah finding out prematurely. The sale was conditional on a quick closing, which suited my purposes perfectly. The date was set for just 3 weeks after the offer was accepted. The day of reckoning arrived swiftly and quietly. The closing on the Elm Street cottage was completed without a hitch. The funds were transferred securely into a separate, newly established bank account that Mark had no knowledge of and was not linked to my usual accounts. Immediately after the closing, I instructed Mr. Harrison to send formal letters to Mark and Sarah. The first letter informed them that the Elm Street property had been sold. The second letter, more impactful, informed them that they had been removed as beneficiaries from my will and that their attempts to pressure me into giving them the property and otherwise attempting undue influence had been noted and documented. It also stated that all future communication regarding financial matters or property should be directed through Mr. Harrison's office. A third letter, delivered separately, was a formal notice that their spare key to my main house was no longer valid, and they were not permitted to enter without my express invitation. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone began ringing incessantly. I let it go to voicemail. Mark's messages were a mix of stunned disbelief, escalating rage, and frantic backtracking. "Mom, what have you done? How could you sell the cottage? That was supposed to be ours. You can't do this. You can't just cut us out. What about your grandchildren?" Sarah's messages were more shrill, filled with accusations of cruelty and selfishness. "You're a terrible mother. After everything we've done for you. This is disgusting." I listened to a few, then turned the phone off. They drove to my house, pounding on the door and ringing the bell continuously. I didn't answer. I watched through the peephole as they grew increasingly desperate, shouting threats and accusations. They finally left, likely when a concerned neighbor looked out. Their shock and panic were palpable, a stark contrast to my own quiet calm. They had lost control, not just of the asset they felt entitled to, but of the narrative. I was no longer the passive mother they could manipulate. I was a woman who had taken decisive action. The truth, supported by Mr. Harrison's letters and the undeniable fact of the sale, began to filter out to extended family and mutual friends. I didn't spread gossip, but when asked directly by trusted relatives, I shared a measured account, backed by the documented evidence I had gathered. Most were appalled by Mark and Sarah's actions, although a few, predictably, urged me to make peace for the sake of the family. I politely declined. There could be no peace where there was such deep-seated entitlement and betrayal. Mark and Sarah made a few final, desperate attempts, tearful apologies that rang hollow, promises to change that felt like new manipulations, even vague threats about my health again. I responded only through Mr. Harrison's office, maintaining the firm boundaries that were now legally established. In the immediate aftermath, my home felt quiet, almost unnaturally so. The constant pressure, the underlying tension of their expectations, was gone. The second property was sold, the funds secure, and my will was updated, my future protected. Mark and Sarah faced the consequences of their actions. Without the anticipated inheritance or my ongoing financial support, they would have to manage on their own. Confronting the financial difficulties their entitlement had prevented them from addressing previously. The relationship with my son and daughter-in-law was permanently altered, a chasm opened by their greed and my necessary self-defense. There was no hope of quick reconciliation. The trust was broken beyond repair. My new life was defined by clear boundaries and a fierce, quiet sense of self-protection. Sitting alone in my living room, the silence was no longer tinged with grief for Thomas, but filled with the quiet satisfaction of a battle won, not through aggression, but through methodical strategy and a refusal to be exploited. I had protected my peace and honored my own worth. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself.